Welcome to Learning Thursdays. I'm Dean Hale with the Oasis Learning and Development Unit and your host for today's presentation. Today's presentation is titled Historical Trauma, Healing and Empowering Latino Communities. And my guests are Professor at Yale University, Dr. Oscar Roaz Perez, and Eric Senor, Training and Technical Assistant Manager at the Hispanic Latino Behavioral Health Center of Excellence. They'll be joining me in a moment, but first, a word about Learning Thursdays. Thursdays are offered to behavioral health professionals as a free learning opportunity with the goal of improving the knowledge and skills of the New York State substance use disorder workforce as we strive to improve the lives of individuals needing prevention, treatment, recovery, and harm reduction services. A goal of Learning Thursdays is to support the professional development of the treatment, prevention, recovery, and harm reduction workforce. We do this by offering regular presentations that are relevant to today's substance use disorder treatment professional. As always, if there are any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to contact us at the Learning Thursdays mailbox. You can use the same mailbox to express an interest in providing a future Learning Thursdays program. And now it's time to presentation and welcome our guests.
Thank you, Dean, for that wonderful startup. It does definitely make my life easy. So thank you so much for having me. And before we get even started, we're going to go ahead and share this message from the Hispanic Latino Behavioral Health Center of Excellence. The Hispanic and Latino Behavioral Health Center of Excellence recognizes the complexities associated with gender and ethnic identification, as well as the right of all individuals to self-identify. The center uses the term Latina with the intention of both facilitating a fluid reading and pronunciation and supporting an inclusive and respectful language. Latina is gender-neutral form of the word Latino that uses the letter E at the end and an idea native to the Spanish language. So that's in the spirit of being inclusive of all folks here. So wonderful. Good afternoon, good morning to folks, depending on what region of the states you're watching this from or coming in. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to view and have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about historical trauma with Latina communities. But even before we get started, I want to go ahead and express my gratitude to the New York State Office of Addiction Services and Support for the invitation to be in community. In addition, I want to acknowledge the Hispanic Latino Behavioral Health Center of Excellence and the co-authors and contributors of Quienes Somos y de Donde Venimos, this book here, which we'll be discussing and bringing examples into life as to how this relates to the mental health of the Latina community. So I want to make sure folks are recognized for their work here as well. And we'll be taking pieces from this book to fill in our discussion. Our team is very appreciative of the opportunity to present, especially during Spanish Heritage Month. So thank you there. So in our discussion for today, we will touch upon important historical events from periods of colonialization to the present day and the impact mental health and identity development on Latina communities, and what we can do as helpers, healers, providers, policymakers to enhance the well-being of the Latina communities. And the goal of the conversation is to briefly discuss this resource, right? And you can, we will be able to provide the link to download, can assist, and even just this conversation can assist mental health providers, clinical educators, policymakers, and researchers to gain a deeper understanding of the various forms of oppression, colonialization, socio-political, and social cultural factors influencing the mental health of immigrants, of immigrant families living in the United States, with specific ethnic roots to Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, with the three latter countries being and forming the triangle. That's a little bit of the roadmap for today. So given the time, we want to make sure we're able to cover as much as possible and also have time for a discussion. So it's going to be the first part of our talk or discussion today is going to be centered on providing folks the context, the examples. And then after that, we're going to move over to more of a dialogue between Eric and myself about how relevant, how we can bring this material to life, especially in mental health spaces for our communities at large. So we're going to start off with a little bit of historical trauma, what it is, provide some examples, and go from there. So, as identified in the literature, historical trauma is the result of massive trauma experience where the dominant group subjugates a population, resulting in segregation and displacement, physical and psychological violence, economic destructions, and cultural dispossessions. Usually, a whole community is impacted by the experience in itself, or the events, or the multiple events. Right? This is not just a one-time event. These are events that are continuously happening over a significant period of time that have a traumatic impact that then essentially gets passed down through generations and generations, which that's framed intergenerational trauma. As a result of the ongoing trauma, a response is to elicit in the first or primary generation that includes physical, social, and psychological responses. So the people who usually experience it first are going to have more severe, for the lack of a better term here, symptoms, right? And those get essentially passed down through other generations and generations. And I'll briefly go over some examples of how that is done. And that initial response are then transmitted to subsequent generations through environmental factors, psychosocial factors, social-economic political systems, and legal and social discrimination. This also, and so when I'm talking about, well, what does this historical trauma look like as it gets passed down from generation to generation? Well, some examples include through the stories that we share, right? So storytelling, and storytelling often is used as a healing method, and also depending on the message that's being sent, it's a method of how these events also get passed down. What is so storytelling? What is shared with subsequent generations? Also, how it is communicated, what is being discussed, or what is being shared of that experience, and even how we go about raising subsequent generations in the messages that we communicate. So oftentimes it's unintentional. So we're not even know what messages we're passing on, or how these messages are impacting subsequent generations. So oftentimes it's unintentional. Sometimes it's even used as a form of education, and it's well intended, and which can result, depending on the individual, of course, can result in having the opposite, right? Versus that being informative is going to have a negative effect or impact. So when we think about the Latin community, or when we're working with Latin populations, it is very, 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 very important to consider the 500-year legacy of domination and subordination by European powers and Anglo-Americans, and how it impacts identity development and presenting mental health and substance use concerns. So this is where I go off on a little tangent, and make this somehow connected to this. But I cannot stress enough the importance of context, 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 context. Knowing the context, knowing the story is going to be very critical when we engage in any type of mental health and or substance use work with populations. The context is really going to be our foundational piece to understanding potentially the root cause, and even taking it a step further, healing ways that folks already bring themselves. So it's knowing the context, knowing the background, having your foundation is key to helping folks in their recovery. Also, as I'm thinking about this too, it's also important to recognize the years of forced colonialization and forced assimilation, and this goes back to the Spaniards in Latin America, and Anglo-Americans in the United States, and which may explain why prior generations and even present-day communities adopt and incorporate dominant cultural values, language, beliefs, and behaviors. And one thing that I will mention is that oftentimes this assimilation, the acculturation, is seen as a negative process, but in fact, it's actually a survival mechanism. So thinking about it or reframing it in a way where both can exist versus it just being one thing, both can exist, right? Loss of culture, there's a loss of cultural identity, and at the same time, you're in a new country with new, with different language, different values, different belief systems. People behave differently, and in order to survive, Latinx folks or Latinx communities and even other immigrant communities to start to adopt and incorporate and even acculturate and take on some of these beliefs, values, languages, and so on as a way to survive in a system. And I will say this, in a system that has been intentionally designed to harm and disenfranchise folks who are not part of the U.S. majority. So, what are some examples and what does this look like? And so what we're going to do is, and as you heard me say before, the context is so important. Knowing the context, knowing the history, knowing the foundation is going to be so important in understanding. So we're going to go back, looking at some brief examples of events, of historical events in Mexico that have contributed to historical trauma. I don't really call them historical events because they're not even 50 years old that occurred in Central America. So Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And I'll give some of these more examples that are really relevant today, right? So when we think about, and before I even kind of go into the slides, what I'm referring to is like not so historical. The civil wars in Central America are not even 50 years old, right? And as a result of the civil wars in Guatemala, you have a lot of child soldiers who came during that time period who are now adults, who could potentially be experiencing substance use concerns, specifically with alcohol, or experiencing mental health concerns. So these events that we're calling historical are not so historical, and they're not even 50 years old, and are having a significant impact on the Latinx immigrant community in the States. When we think about Mexico, Mexico has a long history, and I'll go into some of those examples here that are still present day having a significant effect on the economic, the well-being, and the physical health of the Mexican community, which is forcing migration, right? So it's all interconnected. So with that said, the 5 year so some examples of historical trauma events that have contributed to the intergenerational trauma contribute to intergenerational trauma includes the 500-year legacy of European colonialization, right? Including Spaniards, the English, the Portuguese, the French, the Anglo-Americans in most recent years, and yeah, very recent years, which have led to enslavement, the plundering of resources, removal of people from their land, et cetera, and genocide, right? These are just some very brief examples. Such events eventually, lead to forced migration, and we see it, and we see this today, right? Many Latin American countries have not fully recovered from the colonialization, which has led to corruption, violence, and even climate change is having a direct impact on migration. Being in most recent years, climate change has become one of the main factors really influencing migration. Currently, also some, as we're thinking of, okay, like these are like historical examples. However, these events have laid the foundation to other events that are not so far in our distant past. So some events include like current relations between the U.S. and Latin American countries that have also really contributed to traumatic events. And some examples, and we may not even really think about this, but I'll provide some context. So when we think of what I'm talking about, so like you're talking about political relations between the U.S. and, like, let's say, for example, Latin America, in this case, Mexico. Like, how does that contribute to historical trauma, or how is that historical trauma? Well, when you think about what we call today the US, Mexico, and Canada agreement, which was used to be known as NAFTA, you may be like, well, what does NAFTA have to do with traumatic events? Well, what does that have to do with anything with migration, the mental health and substance use of communities? And those are very valid questions. And my response to that is, well, when you think about that, when I work to it as NAFTA, because that's what it's, people really know it as, that those policies between, Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. Led to the construction of new road infrastructure in the regions of Mexico where it was heavily populated by indigenous populations. So you start to see new roads, you start to see all these developments happening, and people are like, great, great, great. But we're not thinking of the impact that that's having on the indigenous communities who are native to those lands. As a result of NAFTA, we had a significant number of indigenous communities leaving the highlands and coming to the US because they didn't know where else to go. Uh, and those experiences, those developments aren't always as smooth as possible. So you have the exploitation of Native people. You have the introduction of potential diseases and et cetera, and other things the native folks are not immune to, right? So as we're thinking about this, almost everything, and I welcome folks or invite folks to think about this from a process and systems lens that is all interconnected. Um, Great. So, given that Latin America is so big, I will bring this closer to home and solely focus on what has occurred in Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries, as I mentioned, which include Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. This is specifically really relevant given the proximity of these four countries to the U.S. and the high number of immigrants coming from these countries, especially in the last 10 years. It is important to note, though, that during the 2009 during 2009 to 2020, there was actually a decline in migration and immigration coming from Latin America to the United States. And give folks a couple of minutes to ponder that. Well, why were folks going back to their countries of origin? Um, so let you ponder that for a little bit. So during those 10 years, right, 2009, 2019, 2020, folks were actually leaving the US to go back to their country. And one of that reason was it was the economic crisis that the US experienced during that time period. So there was a good 10-year gap where we saw a decrease in migration and folks actually going back to their countries of origin. However, in recent years, with the pandemic and a lot of political turmoil and government corruption and so many other things that have occurred in Latin America, now we're starting to see an uptake in folks coming to the US. In the last 5 years since COVID, I'm pretty sure many of you saw articles, saw the news clips, saw a lot of things talking about a border crisis that was happening all around the Rio Grande Valley, where you had the encampments, where you had so many things happening, which is a result of historical trauma, historical events that have harmed Latin communities. So one thing that is important to note is that indigenous groups, when we think about history, right, we always have to go back to the beginning of time. And in this case, in Latin America, indigenous groups were sovereign nations, each group having its own government, social system, language, and cultural traditions. It's been, written that the Maya civilization lasted over a millennium and has been described as one of the most advanced civilizations that has ever existed, right? So we're going to focus on, the Northern Triangle countries, Mexico, again, given the proximity of countries to the U.S. And I'll show some examples along the way of how having this background knowledge is so important when we treat, um, because it lets us know the lived experiences of people, right? So here, when we think about indigenous pre-colonial communities in Latin America, here we have some examples of indigenous communities prior to colonialization. And as you may see here, this is just a small list, but there were hundreds, right? So, for example, in Mexico, you had the Zapoteco. In Guatemala, you had the Quiche. In El Salvador, you had the Pipil. And in Honduras, the Pec. We also had in Puerto Rico the Taínos, and Taínos actually were in the Caribbean area, right? So there's a lot of indigenous groups that have existed for years and that still exist today. I think the last article that I read about, gosh, I want to say 5 years ago, 50% of the population in Guatemala still identified as Maya. So there's still large indigenous communities in these countries, with the exception, I believe, of Honduras. And then there's a whole history behind that, but there's very, very few indigenous communities left in Honduras. So you may be asking, well, what does colonization look like? What does it have to do with what we're dealing today, with the crisis, the mental health crisis, the substance use crisis that we're experiencing? Um, well, let's go back a little bit, actually not a little bit, a whole lot, to 1519 to 1521. And colonization looked like the invasion of the Spanish military, which enslaved African folk and oftentimes warriors from indigenous communities. The Spanish had a lot of advantage. Of course, they had steel swords, horses, and military strategies that folks in what is now the U.S. and Mexico and Guatemala and Salvador and Honduras weren't exposed to or didn't know, right? So there was a significant advantage that the Spaniards had. They also set up economienda systems, a system of forced labor imposed on indigenous workers, which was exploitive, right? The Spanish plundered the cotton, the indigo, the cacao, and the minerals, and the work of people. Some accounts of some of the battles, especially when we think about, I want to say, the Pipil were in El Salvador. Um, that the Pipil cotton armor of the folks was so heavy that they had a difficult time getting up when they fell. And what occurred was when they were down, the Spaniards would murder them while they were on the ground defenseless. So these are some of the acts that are still really relevant and still that continue to have a significant impact. We may not be thinking about it, or we may not think they're relevant, but they really are so important. And when we think about the holistic existence of the Latinx community. Some key facts here, right? We had the invasion of America by the Spanish 1519, 1521, unleashed mass deaths and diseases. Some records suggest that it eliminated 90% of the native population in Mexico and across the Americas. Indigenous communities perished through violent and often due to exposure to infectious diseases introduced by the colonizers, from which the native people had no immunity, right? So no defenses to be able to bounce back. And indigenous communities were made up of numerous kingdoms and cities that often lacked a common identity and political cohesion. And the lack of unity allowed the Spaniards to conquer one kingdom at a time, right? So given that there was no consensus, no unity, it made it that much easier for the Spanish to take over. And these are some important facts to know and have in our back pockets. So before I even move forward, one thing that I often say, and this is nothing new, I'm pretty sure you've all heard this in various spaces, is that in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you've been. Before we know how to engage in healing, we have to know what was used in the past as a healing method. So knowing our history is going to allow us to know in which direction to drive. So here, we start to see some more examples, right? So periods of colonial rule by the Spanish monarchy is characterized by physical, sexual, and spiritual violence. So when we think about spiritual violence, the best example that I have is forcing Catholicism on native indigenous communities in Latin America, well, what we call today Latin America. When we think about another form of the monarchy includes like intellectual violence. Folks may be asking, well, what is intellectual violence, Oscar? Well, that can include colorism, hierarchy of color, the beliefs and the ideas and practices that the the dominant group is imposing and forcing on vulnerable populations, right? You also have economic, social, medical, religious displacements and eradication, along with forced assimilation, acculturation, which we continue to see today. And I provided some examples earlier what that looked like. And historically, right, when we look in the literature, acculturation and assimilation is often seen as a negative from a negative lens. However, it's been one of the tools that has led to the survival of many of these Latin communities throughout history. You also have mestizaje, and when we think about those things, these are some of the impacts in all the ways that, well, not all, but in most ways that indigenous groups into present day Latin America were impacted. As you heard me say earlier, there wasn't such a collective unity among these sovereign nations, among these indigenous communities across present-day Latin America. But what united them at the end, so after the invasion, all were united by collective experiences of suffering and oppression. And that's what often brings people together, along with hope. So I promise I'm not going to make it all dark, but I'm trying to do a balance here. So let's bring this even more. Let's narrow this down a little bit more. So now I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about some specific examples that are really relevant today that happened many, 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 many years ago, dating back to the US-Mexico War. So let's look at an example that continues to have a significant impact on the mental health and substance use of the Mexican American community in the United States. This includes the US-Mexico War, consequences of US and Mexico relations, and post-US Mexico War. So conflict between Mexico and the United States commenced after the New Spain, pre-colonial Mexico gained independence from Spanish rule in 1821. So 1821, long time ago, we're still seeing the impact of this. It started with the annexation of the Republic of Texas by the U.S. and dispute over the boundary of Texas between present-day Mexico and the United States. And the reason why I have these maps up is because oftentimes we forget that all of this used to be Mexico, right? All of this used to be Mexico. And I'll go over some examples here. And an important fact before I even move forward, right? So the dispute between Mexico and the United States was the result of the annexation of the Republic of Texas. And there is a record showing that the U.S. government actually baited Mexico into coming into the U.S. To fight over Texas, land scheme and so on. And so you have to dig deep to find that, right? That Mexico was baited coming into the U.S. Because records show that that it was all a result of Mexico being upset or angry because of the loss of Texas, but they were actually baited, which then the U.S. said, "Hey, you came into our land. Now we're going to go into your land, and we're going to take about 35%, maybe 50% of your land." So Mexico and the U.S. At the time sent armed forces over the disputed area, which was actually just Texas in itself. Texas was huge. The result of that, Mexico lost Texas and half of its territories, including what is present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. This essentially became known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, with Mexico ceding half of its territory. So, so 50% of the territory for $15 million, right? So think about it. The dispute was just about Texas. But this goes deeper than the dispute about Texas. This goes back to our history class. If you all recall in your history classes in elementary school, there's this concept of manifest destiny, that it was the USS Wrights and those who came from Europe, that anything west from the Atlantic belonged to the United States, and that mentality has genuinely contributed to the disenfranchisement of racial and ethnic minoritized communities. In this case, the Latinx community. And this is just an example of that, right? So if the dispute was just about Texas, but you end up taking Texas, you end up taking Arizona, you end up taking California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming. It's like, whoa, you start to really see manifest destiny have a significant impact there. Um, Another important aspect to know is that some folks after the war, um, there was a lot of folks who originated and were had history and roots in Texas that stayed that experienced significant discrimination, that their land was taken. There were so many negative things that these folks experienced as a result of this, right? Even though in the treaty it said folks would be treated fairly, they'd be treated equitable, folks would stay on their land, and so on and so on. All these empty promises that actually never happened. So, movement of the border brought land displacements, forced assimilation, and marginalization to indigenous and non-indigenous Mexican communities. There is little recognition of the first occupants of the Southwest Mexico and the indigenous Mexican populations. Since the annexation of Mexican territory to the United States, rightful inhabitants have been treated as second-class citizens, and this is what I was alluding to earlier. So when we think about this, right, and I want to point something out here, this is 1846 to 1848, maybe a little under 150 years, I would say. So that's basically maybe 3, 4 generations that we're speaking about. So this is why these experiences get passed down, this information gets passed down, and so on, and all these things that I mentioned earlier. So this is why it's still really relevant today. Uh, it said that the cultural genocide experienced by Mexican communities created a soul wound passed on for generations, which we still see today. So now shifting over, and now we're going to go further down south, and we're going to briefly touch on some examples of some historical events in Guatemala that have contributed to historical trauma for the Guatemalan community. And this is very specific to the Civil War. And I will point out, right, as I said, we call it a historical event, but it's really not a historical event. When we look at the dates 1960 to 1996, I believe it hasn't even been 30 years. 30 years, maybe my math is off. But no, no, no. Yeah, it hasn't even been 30 years, maybe close to 30 years since the war ended, right? So there's, what we're starting to see um, the impact, and as you may all know, the impact of war takes years and generations for folks to recover from it. So 1960, keep that date in mind. The Civil War in Guatemala has been described as the longest and most violent civil wars of Central America between liberals or leftist rebels and conservatives rooted in unfair land distribution and the tension with the United Fruit Company, which was a United States company. Most affected by this civil war were people who were indigenous communities in the highlands, right? So there's a trend here. Folks that are most often impacted are indigenous groups, and that is the history of the U.S. Some of the data suggests that the Guatemalan economy greatly suffered. And between 1980 and 1990, I'm going to say that decade has been referred as the lost decade. Between 1980 and 1985, roughly 60,000 to 150,000 indigenous people were murdered or disappeared. 440 villages were destroyed and over 1 million indigenous people displaced. In 1996, the United Nations mediated a peace treaty, which led to the end of the war. But the origins of this and history shows and readings suggest that the Civil War was sparked by the United States. Especially if you heard me in this slide, was that the tension rose because of the United Fruit Company. An interesting fact, too, right? This is all really important because you have civil wars in El Salvador, in Central America. You also have them in Honduras. You have them all throughout Latin America. And there's one important component here that is often not discussed or overseen. But a lot of these wars were the result of the US trying to stop the spread of communism. So that's very important for us to keep in our back pockets as well, right? So making sure that we have all the history and all the information that we need. So now let's transition and look at another historical event, again, not so historical, in modern day El Salvador, which was the La Matanza in the Civil War. And it's really important to note, too, that El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, yet the most densely populated. Therefore, when large events such as the war occur, ramifications impact nearly every citizen. This occurred in 1932 with the massacre of tens of thousands of indigenous men, women, and children. Estimates up to 30,000 30,000 by the Salvadoran military. In response to indigenous rebellion protesting President Martin's oppressive policies, Martinez banned indigenous dress, language, and culture. So you start to see this oppressive belief of actually forced assimilation, right? You start to see that here. The president at the time, Martinez, ordered the military to shoot anyone in traditional dress or having indigenous features. So this is where you start to see the diminishing of the indigenous populations in El Salvador, and also you start to see that in Honduras as well. Like I said, I think some of the records are unsure of how many indigenous populations are still in El Salvador and Honduras. It's a very small, 2-3%. That's what some of the research suggests. But in Guatemala, it's still 50%. So let's continue to move forward. Accumulations of centuries of oppression, human rights violations, and political tensions has really negatively impacted El Salvador and Salvadorian populations. You have the and you also see this in Guatemala too. You have the hallmark of what is known as death squads, extrajudicial executions, and forced disappearances of about 70,000 folks. And the death squads and even the death caps were essentially you see someone on the road, you take them and you murder them, right? Um, and at the time period too, there was a significant massacre of the most vulnerable populations. You see the massacre of women, children, the elderly, people who were sick, people in hospitals, including prisoners, right? And this is 1980 to 1992. So again, when we think about the grand scheme of things, I think this one here is about a little over 30 years ago. So other, modern day Salvador events include after the loss of families and, recruit. There's a great film. I'm trying to remember. I want to say Innocent Voices actually really does a great job at depicting what I'm talking about. So if you have a chance, uh, I highly recommend watching Innocent Voices, which really speaks to modern day Salvador Civil War. And and it really does a nice job at depicting guerrilla forces going in and recruiting child soldiers. So, as you heard me say earlier, child soldiers who were recruited at the time period are now adults and living in the US, some living in the US who experience substance use issues, specifically with alcohol, and also experience significant trauma. So, as we think about it, it's like, well, like with this, is giving you that context that you need and information that you need to better understand uh, the root or the origin of the presenting concern. Okay. Now let's shift over and briefly talk about Honduras. I want to make sure we get to the to the other important part where we talk about, okay, knowing this history, knowing these events, knowing this impact, what can we do to help it heal our community? So when we think about it, Honduras, you have the Spanish regulation and incompetence coupled with land being overly harvest. So its records show that about a lot of the silver in Honduras was depleted, and was impacted the most were the indigenous communities. Present day, you also had the banana industry, which spread across Honduras, which resulted in political tension with the U.S. Um, this was characterized by exploitation of labor in Honduras, in essence, becoming an American colony. Banana companies developed railroads, irrigation systems, pest controls, at very low cost of the employees, harsh working conditions. So I mentioned this earlier too, right? You have this idea of like development, which again, it's great, but we're not thinking about those who are impacted. Those who are impacted tend to be the most vulnerable, which are indigenous populations who are exploited for their work, paid very minimal, exposed to very harsh working conditions. And as a result, you start to see we're starting to see now the impact and the residue of such treatment. Um, Other things too, and I won't really touch on this. I want to make sure we get to the conversation, but the Honduras Salvador Soccer Wars of 1969, which sparked a lot of tension among El Salvador and Honduras. And this was the result, and I'll say this very briefly. This is the result of Salvadoran folks migrating to Honduras, and the Honduran community not knowing what to do with the influx of immigrants coming from El Salvador. So there was a lot of tension that started to surface there, which led to a mini war, which is called the Soccer Wars, which also happened during World Cup qualifying time periods. But this was also a very pivotal period because you start to see folks who are being hurt, who've been exposed to military forces and so on. And this is what 1969. So as we start to think about, well, what is next? What models? What do we think about? An important thing to think about is that at the center of all of this is colonialization, which then contributes to oppression, marginalization, intergenerational trauma, mental and physical health impact, and racism, systemic racism that we see today in many different forms. I often say that it disguises itself throughout time, and the same people, the same populations, the same communities continue to suffer. And I'm not going to say that there hasn't been progress. Yes, there has been progress. And at the same time, right, two truths can exist. It's important to recognize that racism disguises itself throughout periods of time to benefit those in power. So, understanding the effects of historical trauma is essential to better understanding presenting concerns. So now we're going to shift over and talk a little bit about some models, some consequences, and not resources, but some final messages of what we can do. So, understanding the effects of historical trauma is essential to better understand presenting concerns. So, take the etiological model of historical trauma and substance use among Mexican and Mexican Americans in the United States. The author Estrada presents how historical trauma influences substance use among Mexicans and Mexican Americans. As you see here, historical trauma, negative social and historical events, has laid a foundation for the socioeconomic characteristics of Mexican and Mexican Americans, including poverty, underemployment, and low educational attainment through structural and institutional oppression, discrimination, and racism. Social, cultural, and social environmental influences include targeted marketing of alcohol, accessibility to drugs, disorganized neighborhoods, and increased police surveillance, which we see in a lot of communities of color. Uh, Potential cultural buffers, right? So some strengths here include concepts such as ethnic pride and cultural identity, which are potentially eroded by discrimination and racism. So constant experiences of racism and discrimination and so on can potentially deplete our strengths, in this case, our cultural identity, and our ethnic pride. These factors are hypothesized to influence alcohol use and drug use among Mexican American men, right? So you have the historical trauma, you have these other factors that are also negatively impacting the community. You along have some cultural buffers that can help, right? Ethnic pride, familism, cultural values. However, these get eroded over constant experiences of discrimination and various forms of racism, which potentially can then lead to substance use. So knowing that background, right? Um, I often say, and we, and while this is true, it is important to hold in a clinical setting as a provider to hold the patient accountable for their progress. And at the same time, it is also important to hold the system accountable. Uh, we oftentimes blame the individual versus thinking about the individual within the oppressive system. So, a systems framework is going to be key as we start to conceptualize presenting concerns, as we start to think about what is contributing, what is underneath the substance issues, what's underneath the traumatic experiences, what's underneath the depression, what's underneath the drug use, right? And oftentimes, folks who are experiencing, and I come from a community mental health clinic, a lot of our folks are experiencing what academics have framed as social determinants of health. But if we think about it, they're systems. Um, it's a system that has really contributed to all these negative mental and substance use concerns being experienced by people. So systemlessness is important here. So some of the consequences, right? When we think about historical trauma, and as you see here, right, you have the social cultural influences, social environmental influence, the social economic influence, and while there may be some cultural buffers, after many experiences, encounters of oppression, racism, prejudice, our ability to bounce back really diminishes. And what you start to see is an erasure of ancestral history, teachings, messages, cuentos, whatever it is, you start to see that less and less and less and less. There's also cultural genocide, internalized racism, sexism, colorism within the communities, religious subjugation, destruction of cultural practices, in the foundation of ongoing inequities. This we start to see here more and more, and this is what some of the research suggests that over a time period, you start to see folks adhere less to the cultural values. And when I'm referring to the values, include like being family oriented, confianza, being collective. You start to see that diminish over time, over generations and generations and generations. So that's kind of one way, an example of destruction of cultural practices or values. Um, Internalized racism and colorism. You start to see that as folks who are on the lighter side of the chocolate spectrum be treated way different than folks on the darker side of the chocolate spectrum. And you see that within family, right? The idea that marry on the lighter side, it's like you're marrying up, you're bettering the race. Some of those messages that are get passed down, right? So these are some examples of the consequences of historical trauma. Um, you also see the internalization of ancestral suffering. So this is why I say how and what is communicated is very important because folks can internalize that. You also start to see folks have this experience of survivor's guilt. I was the fortunate one. I was the one who made it out. Why did I do it? Why did I make it out? Why did not, those who came before me or my friends or family? You also start to see the experience of somatization. And as you see from the mental health literature, Latin community members, not all, right, but the majority do experience mental health and substance use concerns through somatic experiences. And that's often expressed through, I had this very weird feeling in my tummy, tension in your back. So when we talk about mental health or when we talk about, mental health disorders with folks, it's very important to be like, help me better understand this pain or this tension or this effect that you're experiencing. What is the root cause of it, right? An example of this includes, and I'll bring my own personal story here. My mom doesn't know this, but she's very famous in my talks. I often use her examples because I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's I lived that, right? Um, During my teenage years, I would go out. Sometimes I wouldn't come home. Morning, my mom would be like, I had this very weird feeling in my stomach, and I couldn't sleep. And at the time, I didn't know any better. I was like, "Oh, mom, you're just, probably didn't eat. You probably ate something wrong, or X, Y, and Z." But as I got older and I got into the field, what my mom was trying to tell me is, I was worried about you. I was feeling anxious about you. You didn't call, didn't come home. I didn't know where you were. But the best thing that she could do, to the best way that she could explain her anxiety and worry thoughts, and I'm just living in anxiety, but let's just go worry thoughts through this experience in her stomach. Um, Even today, I call my mom once a week. Um, if I miss a week, she'll call me and be like, I had this presentimiento. I hadn't heard from you. Are you okay? And I'm like, Mom, those are your worries. This is me, right? Trying to like put her experience in a Eurocentric model of anxiety. But for her, it's through the somatic experiences that she experiences her worry, thoughts, her sadness, or other emotions, right? You also see numbing, internalized depression, and colonization, right, from a personal lens. So this is very important as we start to transition to other aspects of the talk, right? The sign of unlimited ultimate oppression working is when the oppressor can take away his hand, stand back, and say, look at what they're doing to themselves. So reflect on that for a little bit. This to me is really powerful, right? When you become when you've been oppressed for centuries and decades, uh, that you really genuinely start to believe that you can't make it out. And you also, this in itself, this quote really resonates with colorism, right? We see potentially, you can see it as a caste system here as well, which this is the legacy of colonialization is colorism, right? The hierarchy that the phenotype, the wider you are, the higher you are on the pyramid here. And you start to see that, right? You have the Spanish, you have the Creoles, mestizos, mulattos, Zambos, indigenous, and African populations, right? So that is in itself the legacy of colonization, which is colorism, and we see that perpetuated in within groups as well. I mean, essentially that happens within group. Um, so some modern day colorism, and this is what some of the research shows, is that more than half of the Latin population say skin color shapes their daily experiences. More than half of Hispanics say having lighter skin color helps to get ahead in the US today. A majority of Hispanics say having lighter skin color is an advantage in this country, right? So this is the legacy of colorism left behind by the Spaniards. So now that we know the context, now that we know some of these events that continue to have a significant impact on the mental health and substance use of the Latin community, we're left with what can we do? What models are out there? What resources are out there? What interventions are out there? What can we do to better serve our community? Well, first is understanding clients, families, children, and communities through a historical trauma lens, meaning understanding the context and the manifestation of behavior, thoughts, etc., as a result of trauma and oppression. So move away from the Eurocentric model of let's pathologize it, let's individualize it, that this is a product of you, and let's look at it from a lens of what have you experienced as a result of the systems that you've been a part of or that your family have been a part of that have led or contributed to the way that you behave, the way you think, and the way that you are, right? Part of it is survival. Part of it is not being able to adjust. So as I think about this, is a model that does not pathologize, but that helps to understand how clients are impacted by historical and intergenerational trauma. Asking ourselves the question, is this a normal response to what occurred? Would anybody else respond the same way? Creating a safe place, physical, social, and emotional, and stable. And what's really important for our community is that consistency, being there. And it's not just being there at the appointments, is following up. I was, calling just to check in how you're doing. The other day, I was at the maqueta and, I saw this and it made me think about you. Like, being holistically there. And what I mean by that, right, when we're creating a safe space, is not just the physical environment, but I think about a safe space as a holistic room, spiritual, emotional, physical, and cognitively, right? Those four things are so important, and which again is underscored by the consistency. Other things in helping folks understand and heal is helping them understand themselves, right? Um, as I was speaking earlier, and I gave that example about my mother, my training would suggest that I would, if she were to come in and be like, oh, I have this pain in my stomach, or I have this stress in my shoulders, or I have this migraine, um, that oftentimes my training would say, oh, that's just a physical concern. Um, but when we're thinking about communities that have been historically impacted by systems of oppression, let's think about how they themselves experience the the symptoms. So what I mean by that is, like, versus them, and you got to think about the context. This is why context is so important, right? Here in the US, we talk about, you go into a mental health clinic and you talk about problems. You engage in psychotherapy, you discuss it, and you have the safe space. These folks didn't have, when we think about, El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras and Mexico, folks didn't have a safe space. Oftentimes they didn't even speak about it. So potentially not being able to speak about it manifested into these somatic experiences. So when we're working with folks, it's, not communicating that it's on your head. It's also, what is your body responding to? What is your body telling you? Right. So going back to the example with my mother, also, um, communicating, how cortisol works, right? The more stress you experience, the longer it's going to take your body to get to that homeostasis place, right? So again, this is a lot of body somatizing experience that we really need to bring into a therapeutic room. Also really explaining, right, how the brain works, the function of the brain. Um, the way I was taught in grad school was that, you're a psychologist, you're trained to be a psychologist, you focus solely on the mind. But what my research and experience and my lived experience, um, and the work that I do really tells me that it's all connected, right? So being able to communicate how the brain works and how the body works, how the spirit works, how the cognition works, and how the emotions work can really, really be so important as we start to engage in psychoeducation, meaning, what are even flashbacks? What do they look like? What does it do? What does it happen? How does it limit executive functioning? Um, so again, a lot of body work here, and this is what some of the research is suggesting for folks. So again, for some folks, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy can be very beneficial. Um, but it's important to not generalize treatment, right? Because there's also within group cultural differences and within ethnic differences, right? Other ways that we can engage in healing include body regulation, breathing exercises. You also have, when you take from a dialectic behavioral lens, a lot of this behavioral activities that can help, mending the shame and belief systems. I think working with shame in itself is very, very, very challenging. And it's actually one of the most strongest emotions. So helping folks work through that shame or beliefs that contribute to shame are so important, and they take a lot of time. A lot of cognitive restructuring happens there. Um, and being in tune, potentially also working from a strength-based perspective, right? Back then, they didn't have therapists. Back then, they didn't have interventions. But what did they have? They engaged in healing circles, healing practices. So tapping into those ancestral wisdom and strengths, resilience, perseverance, and in Latin culture, you have the attitude that you continue to move forward regardless of what's happening. So you have this ganas, you have this persistence, that we can access, right? So working from a strength-based perspective is going to be so important. And also, communicating the importance of living intentionally. In our clinic, and when we start to do treatment goals, we don't talk about treatment goals from a Eurocentric lens. And this is why when we talk about living intentionally, in the US, we talk about, well, what is your treatment goal? You have one, two, or three. And when you literally translate goals into Spanish, it's metas. And what meta suggests is that you have a starting point and an end point. But recovery and healing does not have an end point. So that's the part of living intentionally. So we actually ask, well, what is your purpose? What is your intention? So there's just some nuances that I think are very important. They're very small. It's nothing drastic. It's nothing, out of this world. They're just little things that can go a long way. Um, went over this. I think I double the slides. So I'm going to continue to move forward. Um, so some intergenerational trauma treatment models include collective healing. So it's not just the parent that you're working with, but it's also the child. It's not just the child that you're working with, it's also the parent that you're working with. It's not just the parent or the child, it's also the community. Of um, who's part of the community, right? So, when you're working from an intergenerational trauma lens, you're actually working with many different generations in treating the trauma. Potentially being able to work through some childhood experiences, childhood trauma. And of course, when folks are really ready to engage in that work, right? We want to be very client, patient, people centered. You also have narrative exposure therapy, right? Which is kind of like not as similar, but I like to think about it this way. It's like mental therapy, telling your story in a coherent and narrative way, really contextualizing the traumatic experience, an opportunity to really inflect in this, engage in a reflective practice of the entire life of the event, cultivating personal respects and rights, and knowing this could also be done in a group setting as well. Some other positive strengths here include becoming a cycle breaker, right? So, and of course, as I speak about it, it sounds so easy, but it's easier said than done. So when we're working with folks, teaching them to be mindful, that it's okay to step out of the box, that it's okay to engage in healing, it's okay not to engage in what you saw and what you were taught, right? That is being harmful. Really connecting with yourself, teaching folks the importance of recognizing what our body is telling us, getting curious about the origins of the pain. Where does it come from? And of course, this must be done delicately, right? Because it's easy for us to get stuck. But if we're curious and it's done in a way that it's going to be educational, of course, it's always encouraged. And really looking back at how we've survived, so the legacy of survival, and how we've healed over time could really be beneficial. So some recommendations here, uh, and this includes looking at things from an intersectional lens. And what I mean by that is we're complex humans, right? We have gender identity, we have sexual orientation, religious orientations, religious affiliations, citizenship status. Like we are very complex, many different identities. So being able to work from an intersectional lens is going to be really important, right? And why it's also important is because while some of our treatments and interventions are really well intended, we're not mindful of how an intervention could be, yes, really working for a client who identifies as male, And it's also important to consider how that same intervention designed for a man may be unintentionally invalidating their religious orientation. So being able to work from an intersectional lens is going to be really important because we want to work with the whole person versus just parts of the person. We want to examine, recognize, and understand the person's lived experience. And this is going to take a lot of homework on our own part, right? This is going to require us to do a lot of work on the back end, a lot of extra readings, extra, training activities. It's really going to take intentionality. Also, reconnecting to the strengths of ancestors. So tapping into ancestral wisdom. In what ways have, your family or friends or community engage in healing? What is it that they do when X and Z happens? Like really tapping in to folks' strength is going to be really important. This can be done from a motivational interviewing lens of simply asking open questions, naming and processing the grief. And naming it is so important. It makes it that real. And once it becomes real, we're able to start to work with it. Keeping in mind that our body, our mind, our spirit, and our soul are one and they're all connected and that they inform one another. So working from a holistic lens is going to be very, very, very important. And addressing the internalized oppressor, right? The beliefs that we've built or that have been instilled as a result of racism and structural inequities and oppression. Other recommendations include here, and let me make sure I get them all, is that knowledge of history is not enough, right? So yes, we've sat through a little history lesson here. Great. What are you going to do with it? That's the next step, right? What are we going to do with this historical knowledge that we just gained? How are we going to include it in our conceptualization? How are we going to use in developing a treatment? How are we going to use in the healing process? Tapping into historical survival strategies, space for mutual healings, product of versus pathology, right? I often say that, and many folks in the recovery world say that recovery has no end date. So making sure that it's thinking about it, and instead of saying a process, I should have changed it to. Instead of saying product, I should have changed it to process because it's a lifelong process versus the pathology of this a one time thing. Psychological reform, instilling hope is very important and critical. And healing for our ancestors in the next generation is going to be very important. Other recommendations, present day things that are very relevant are knowing what's going on at the border, right? In the past 5 years, we're starting to see a border crisis where we started to see children in cages, folks being whipped. So tapping into our local, and this is kind of jump into a little bit of the political realm, but connecting with our state, city, and really thinking about what can we do at the political level to help heal the crisis that is going on and that has been going on at the border, right? What can we do there? Uh, there's also this awareness of increased mental health concerns, right? Uh, the most recent data suggested that the second leading cause of death among Latin men it was suicide. So making sure that we're disseminating, we're doing outreach, that we are really increasing the knowledge and awareness of the impact of mental health and substance use. Importance also knowing of how policy and mental health are interconnected. When we think about the 45th president, a lot of the laws and policies that were enacted really had a significant impact on the mental health of our community, right? When you think about the Remain in Mexico policy, Title 42, you think about all these policies really negatively impacted the Latinx community. And of course, we want to make sure there's always funding for research to further investigate how we can help our communities heal. And of course, always reshaping policy is at the forefront. gosh, I have a lot of recommendations here. Um, Also, another thing is, as I mentioned earlier, taking into consideration the various contextual and cultural factors. So, what I mean by that is not only knowing the history, but also knowing the within family dynamics. How was this person raised? What is their belief systems? Um, and keeping in mind, right, that there are so many within group ethnic differences. So, the belief systems in the context and the cultural factors practiced by one Latin group is not going to be the same of another Latinate group. Um, Making sure that we're culturally responsibly training the next generation of psychologists, and not only training the next generation of culturally responsive providers that are bilingual, bicultural, but also really thinking about teaching cultural, I mean, not we often talk about cultural humility, but let's talk about clinical humility. Knowing that we don't know it all and that we have limitations as providers and that we can always learn from the people that we're working with. And that goes along with enhancing clinical practice and really, really informing policy for more funding and opportunities in clinics for the Latin community. And that wraps up this portion of the presentation. We're going to shift over and engage in a back and forth with Eric here.
Hi, Oscar. Thank you so much for bringing such insightful information. My name is Eric Senior. As Dino mentioned earlier, I'm the training technical assistant specialist for the Hispanic and Latino Behavioral Health Center of Excellence. So I want to thank the New York State Office of Services and Recovery and Addiction for the time here and for letting us in Hispanic Heritage Month bring such an important topic about how our communities live and how they heal. And I guess as I was hearing you, Oscar, I would think of my time as a therapist in New York, and I worked with a lot of Hispanic and Latinx folk from Mexico, Puerto Rico, El Salvador, Dominican Republic. Many were the children and grandchildren of populations that have migrated to the States 40, 50, 60 years ago, right? And had witnessed, lived this experiences, this traumatic experiences in their home countries. But in a way, also we're reliving through that intergenerational components, aspects of lived experience that were affecting them in terms of the mental health, in terms of maybe going to substance use or survival mechanisms. And a lot of the things that I thought as I was hearing you is, and a practitioner, a provider, is how do we start conversations with our clients about the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma on mental health and substance use? So what's a respectful way to start those conversations?
Yeah, you know, I definitely, and sometimes I think my answers are really out there. So if they are, you let me know. Um, but I think sometimes we as, and I'll say myself, I don't want to include everybody else, the field and the way that I was trained is we complicate just a lot of things. I think we try to be uh, in explaining how to even broach the topic. There's a model on how to broach the topic. There's a model on or a training manual on like what to say, how to say certain things, how to ask. And as I think about it, I'm like, yeah, this is great, this is great, this is great, cool, cool, cool. But it's manualized. And as we think about the history of our folks and we think about psychotherapy is not only new, it's even newer to our communities. So here we may have this model, here we have this manual on how to broach the topic. And as you were asking, I'm like, storytelling. Storytelling has been in our cultures for a significant period of time. And as a way of asking or even broaching, you can combine a motivational interviewing approach to a cuento approach and even just asking, like exploring family history, right? Like, tell me your family story. Um, and I think that in itself may be a great segue to then how has that influenced you, right? Um, so oftentimes in the clinical work that I do, before I even engage in the individual work, I create that space to be like, tell me your family's story. Um, and and as we engage in that work, you have stories of like, oh my, growing up in Puerto Rico, we were very poor. And my grandparents had a farm, and we worked the farm at the age of like 5. And when you think about it, it's like, well, and this is where we as clinicians have to do our job. Well, why were they working at such a young age? What was going on? What happened in Puerto Rico, right? You have colonialization, right? So just even to be not so long-winded, one is being straightforward, right? Just being transparent, being honest, asking the question. I think sometimes we get afraid to just ask the question, and I think that when we're trying to come up with the most creative way, just asking how it is really works for our community. I think, and also it's like inviting or creating space for folks to tell you their family's story, their family's lived history, because that's also going to inform your conceptualization. It's going to give you the data to like why, so and so behaves this way, why they respond in such a manner, why is it that they're irritable much quicker, right? So one, being straightforward and just simply asking, um, and I often say this too, right? Is that providers want to have the best open-ended question. We want to have the best reflection. We want to have the best therapeutic session. And this is where I go into my process of clinical humility, which is being okay with being wrong and allowing the client or the person that you're working with to tell you, right? So an example that I use when I teach motivational interviewing is make a reflection and be comfortable knowing that if you're wrong, the person that you're working with will correct you. So if you ask the question in this case, you ask it how it is. If the person is not ready, then they're gonna be like, "I'm not ready to go there. I'm not ready to talk about this." And again, then that is really becomes client centered, because then we're working off the agenda of the person that we're working with and not ours. Right? If we're ready to address the trauma, then or we just want to ask it and we're like, this is the root cause. But if they're not ready, granted, you have to take into account avoidance and what that looks like, right? Um, but it's complex, but it's also easy. It's being straightforward and being okay with being told no, and engaging in that clinical humility.
Absolutely. And, you started off responding to questions about, manualized treatment. It can be very helpful in many ways, but there's some aspects of when we are working with groups, Hispanic and Latino and Latina groups, who have been marginalized, excluded, where maybe a manualization might not be the most humane way to start talking about the history of their family, getting to know about their ethnic identity, getting to know about different dimensions in their lives and their context and their neighborhoods and their communities, where questions from a humble stance and from where you say you are the expert in your recovery, in your healing. I want to learn from you. And I think that sounds like it can be very powerful to also learn about all this history, as you mentioned in the earlier part of the presentation, right? Those stories can come, maybe they didn't experience it themselves. Their grandmother, their abuela, grandmother did. And those stories came out through some ways that you might have the privilege to hear from them and to incorporate into the work you do together. And so that also, makes me think about, you mentioned definitely at the end in terms of recommendations of this, or thinking of strengths and strength-based approaches. So how can you think providers effectively integrate the strength and resources within Hispanic and Latina communities in their treatment approaches, especially when we're thinking about trauma, we're thinking about recovery, substance use, how we leverage those strengths. And I'm thinking of, again, those cultural buffers, right? Ethnic identity, families, etc.
Yeah, great question. You know, again, I think maybe I talk about it in a very simplistic way, and it never goes that way, right? Like I can talk about it, and I'm like, oh, cool, blah blah blah. Um, but one thing that I do in the clinical work, and working with folks, is, granted, there has to be the space. So even before we can start to integrate these cultural strengths or healing methods, is knowing what they are, right? So one thing that I do anytime that I start working with a person, and I really do work from a motivational interviewing lens, right? But let me back up a little bit. As many folks know, right, in motivational interviewing, you have the MI spirit, which is composed of four domains. One being partnership, and partnership and collaboration is the idea that you have two experts in the room, right? The expert clinician who's an expert in the intervention, and the other expert is the person that you work with who is an expert in their own lived experience, right? So knowing that and working from that lens, then what I do in one of the first initial sessions, and of course there has to be space, there has to be trust, there has to be rapport, there has to be the very basic clinical components, is that I ask, and of course I ask for permission. I'm like, hey, is it okay if I ask you the question? And if you don't feel comfortable, that's okay. I often ask clients in the earlier sessions, um, tell me about one of the most difficult times in your life, and how did you overcome it? What did you do? Who was your support system? How long did it take you? What was that process like? What I'm doing there is I start to generate how they themselves already know how to get out of what they're experiencing. Maybe they just need a little boost, a little uplifting, a little bit of cheerleading, right? Um, but they don't need this complex new way or incongruent way of healing when they themselves already have within themselves what they need to heal. And our job is essentially to evoke that, right? And to empower them. And one of the ways that I do is I simply just ask, I invite you to reflect on an experience or multiple experiences in your life that have been really difficult, and how did you overcome them? What did you do, and what was that process like? In that, the person tells you, well, I just kept going. Great persistence. Well, I went to go look for resources here. I went to go look over there. I knocked on doors. Great, they're resourceful. Um, I really sought out people who I trusted. Great, they have a community support, right? Like so as you start to see through that simple question, the person's going to tell you everything that you need. You just have to ask the right question. And the way you start to integrate it, so once you've collected ways that they've healed and ways that they themselves already know works for them, and of course, if there is an opportunity for us to add to their healing strategies, we can ask for permission and be like, hey, is it okay if I make additional recommendations? So what can enhance it? But once you have all that data, then you start integrating it into your work, right? So if a client is feeling really isolated, oh, well, I remember you saying that at one point in your life, you were really close to X, Y, and Z person. What are your thoughts about reaching out to them or connecting with them? Or, you mentioned that you're really down on your luck right now and you don't know um, where to go for help. Well, you're here and you're seeking help right now. That shows and tells me that you're not giving up, that you're resourceful, that you have persistence, right? And and a good way to do that is by providing a lot of affirmation and bringing that into that space. You're super insightful. And you're really resourceful. You're really caring. You are like you start to bring these in. However, the most important part to this is that they have to be genuine, positive, um, and there's three ingredients. There's genuine, positive, to an affirmation, and gosh, I always forget. So it's genuine, positive. There's another one that's an ingredient to an affirmation, but you start to integrate them into the healing spaces when you think that it could be beneficial or serve as a buffer to this person, right? So how do you even bring ethnic identity into the space, right? A person is experiencing discrimination. You can bring in, well, you mentioned that you're a very proud Puerto Rican person. How do you demonstrate that? How do you show that? What does it make you feel? What does it prompt you to feel when uh, it's non-verbally communicated that you're Puerto Rican or verbally communicated, right? Like, and you start to really integrate it into the space and utilize that on the road to recovery.
Absolutely. That's so beautifully put. And I think you integrated there many ways in what can be a practitioner space, a humane space. It is, you mentioned empowerment and you mentioned evoking. And those two aspects, I think, bring about the how the client is the expert of their life, but also respecting and acknowledging idioms in identifying what some may call idioms of resilience. And I think from the perspective of Hispanic and Latino folk, there's a lot of sayings, sometimes in Spanish, like we say in Puerto Rico, they may say, en la brega, luchando, they are saying to self in self-talk ways, I've been doing a lot. I've been doing a lot to stay above a survival mechanism and reaching out and performing ways of being in this world that in which I can heal. And it sounds like you say, as a practitioner, as a provider, me really there to remind them of being there, right? And that's I think that definitely taps into recovery as well. And recovery that being center recovery centered around empowerment. So
Yeah, no,
absolutely.
as you're speaking, it really reminds me, right? It's like we're not adding anything new. People are already engaging in this. They already done it, and it's just our job to remind them, to enhance their own personal empowerment, because it's like when you think about even behavior activation strategies that in psychology we have framed as behavior activation strategy. I'm like, our people have been doing behavior activation for years, um, and they're already doing it, right? So maybe they can do more of that behavior activation that they're engaging in. Maybe they can do a little bit more of their gardening, of whatever it is, and it's just more of like bringing it into the space, and it's utilizing what they come with and working from there. So yes, there's going to be time and opportunities to enhance and add. However, we're not working from a deficit. We're not working from negative or from a zero. We're working from like, if you're thinking about steps, you're probably working from the step 10th and you maybe need to go 10 more, right? And 10 more is a lot less than 20.
I think that's a beautiful note in terms of you mentioned it almost jokingly at one point when you said, I don't want to get too dark and gloomy, but then, we need to acknowledge and recognize past, present, and persistent historical wrongs and trauma and oppression. But then when we're with the person, we are evoking how they experienced it, how they lived it, how we can join them. Not tell them, but join them. Steps towards recovery, mental health, and substance use.
Yeah, no, it's both things can exist, right? Two truths can exist, and knowing that gloomy history really is gonna equip you with the tools to know how to move in which direction.
And well, I want to thank you because I think part of this conversation is here again as an invitation today, and as part of Hispanic Heritage Month, really is a way to make visible and open up stories and conversations of our histories, who we are, our voices, and how we connect and help as providers both within and outside the Hispanic and Latino communities, but as part of a movement towards equity services. Um, I want to thank again the Office of Addiction and Services Supports of New York State for having us. And I want to thank you, Oscar, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's always great to be in community, and it was my pleasure. So thank you for the invitation.
I want to thank my guests today, and I hope you all find it useful while assisting clients in need of services. Your feedback is important to us. It helps us to know if we're meeting your educational goals and expectations. Once you have viewed the presentation in its entirety and completed the quiz, if prompted, please follow directions to access the SurveyMonkey website and take a moment to complete the evaluation, including suggesting any future topics for Learning Thursdays. Once again, thank you for joining us and keep up the good work.